Okay, so this is a presentation called Truly Self-Evident, a Theological Consideration of the Declaration of Independence. So this is a presentation that I've been meaning to give for a while. I was actually scheduled to give it back in Atlanta at our last meeting. We just had so much content that we had to kind of shuffle things around, so I didn't get a chance to do it. But I'm excited to give it here in D.C. I think you'll find this more appropriate, and not just because of the document at the National Archives, but also because D.C. tends to be a place where people throughout the country draw identity. We tend to look to Washington, D.C. to tell us what to do in times of crises, or when something terrible is going on, or during State of the Unions. We're always looking to D.C. During those times for a sense of who we are as an American people, what actually brings us together. And so I consider the Declaration of Independence to be at the heart of that, and I think a lot of other people do as well. Most of you know the history of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson being the lead writer, but not the only one, of course. There was 5 writers, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, all came together to be able to write this document. And the basic history of that document, again, as many people know, is that it didn't cite political philosophy for itself. It obviously used political philosophy for an end. So it was political philosophy used to justify action, not action used to justify political philosophy. It's an assumption that's used in the Declaration of Independence, not an argument in itself. It's therefore blatantly normative. It's even hypocritical, right? When it was actually written, there was talk about equality in the document, and yet that wasn't really the case with Thomas Jefferson trying to write out slavery and not being successful. In fact, an abolitionist, Thomas Day, in 1776, wrote that if there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot signing resolutions of independency with the one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. Really calling out Thomas Jefferson there and saying, on the one hand, you're talking about equality, but this isn't what you actually practice in your daily life. Nevertheless, through our country's history, important leaders have actually gone back to the Declaration of Independence to be able to find a mantra, to find a goal or a theme for the presidency or even for the country as a whole. This is what we're trying to embody here. And I can pull examples throughout history. Lincoln is probably the most obvious one, right? His Gettysburg Address, of course, famous for invoking clauses from the Declaration of Independence. His debate with Stephen Douglas, he said the following: "The founders did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were there then actually enjoying that equality, or yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even, though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value to all people of all colors everywhere." So Lincoln clearly saying, hey, the document wasn't actually descriptive of our country at the time, but it's what we wanted. It's what we want this country to be. As recently as George Bush, you have Republicans saying that the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all Americans are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he's talking on National Sanctity of Human Life Day. He says that we celebrate the sacred gift of life. Our nation has made significant progress in recent years towards building a culture of life. So he's invoking the Declaration of Independence to justify his pro-life stance. Obama has done the same for his policies, saying that we the people must make the task our own, to live up to the words of the Declaration of Independence and secure liberty and opportunity for our children and for future generations. So politicians of all parties have invoked this, which means that the Declaration isn't just a historical document, right? It's also a theme. And because it is, it's important that we actually understand the political philosophy behind it and find the extent to which we fully agree with it. It's taken a lot of times as an assumption that every aspect of the document is true, or why challenge it. But if it's so important, and if we defend it so publicly, if you're conservative, you probably do, then where do you actually stand privately? To what extent do you agree with every word in the document? And so that's what I want to give you in this presentation, is an actual serious look. I'm not disputing the historical importance of the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, it's been invaluable to our country's progress in the years, but I do want to consider it from a theological and a philosophical perspective and to weigh it on that basis and see it for what it is. And I think that will help us as we defend it. So, starting off, let's examine the Declaration of Independence within philosophical context. So, a little bit different than the historical that I just gave you. So, I've given you a sheet of just some of the most notable philosophers that we're going to talk about. And feel free to bring up some Q&A after this if you have questions. I'm going to go pretty quickly through the moderns. You'll see on the front page Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke. And if you've taken any political philosophy class, you've probably heard of these guys. So Hobbes, I'm not going to read all these quotes, a lot of writing here, just some of the most important quotes from their major works. So briefly on Hobbes, what you're looking at here is a political philosophy before the Declaration of Independence, but that I will argue later set the stage for it. So we'll go through each one of these three guys, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke, and then we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence and how it fits into that context. So Hobbes, very quickly, you're looking at a political system or system of thought in which Hobbes believed that humans naturally seek power. He wrote extensively about this, that humanity seeking power, and each man and woman seeking power leads to a natural state of war. Insecurity and fear comes up in this environment, and that's where society actually comes from. So he writes that natural law is a rule or condition which man obeys to preserve his life. So he's very concerned here with the survivability of man, and society tends to solve this problem. Fear of oppression is people to join society, and then society originates justice and enforces it through power. So we give up our rights, we give up our ability to make decisions about ourselves, and you see that in the quote that I provided. And by doing so, we have protection. We can survive. So equality may or may not be true in a state of nature, is what Hobbes is arguing, but we have unity and peace through the strength that we bring together. And so Hobbes would be the type of person that would look probably today at the controversy surrounding the NSA and signals intelligence and cell phone collecting and say that's justified, most likely, because the country is doing what it thinks is right to be able to protect us all. And that's why we're here in the first place. So let's go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt. That's what government is for. So that's Hobbes speaking. Again, drawing a lot of his statements and his beliefs from the idea of a state of nature. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you see that same concept of a state of nature, of a time before society began, which justifies its existence later in a lot of these guys. Most of all, Rousseau. So Rousseau wrote extensively on the state of nature. He defined humans not so much by their lust for power or desire to seek it, as by their free will. That's what separates us from animals. That's what makes a man a man. So he said that he had a lot more respect or appreciation or longing for that state of nature period than Hobbes did. He saw that time before government, whether it was hypothetical or actually existed, but the very concept of it, it's a time when man was actually stronger than he is today. So during survival of the fittest or evolutionary society in which civilization hasn't actually occurred, man was stronger than he is because he was out there, running around, being able to make his own food. He was having to exercise every day to be able to fight his own battles, and he didn't have society there to do it for him. So modern society, therefore, has made people weak, is what he believed, and increased their inequality. So he talks about actual physical inequality that men and women have as they are actually born, and then he talks about an inequality that grows within society after that. So now we don't just have physical inequality, we have economic inequality. We have numerous different standards and talents that people are able to develop that others aren't, and that increases their inequality. And so the result for Rousseau is that we need a social contract that actually brings people as close as we can back to that original state of nature. So a transparent government, something in which we actually can be as free as possible. And at the same time still having minimal protection to be able to function in society was his goal. And then finally, Locke. So Locke wrote that humanity inherits the earth. He cited some scripture in his first treatise on government, and he said that God gives men and women the earth to rule as they so choose, and that people enjoy property rights to the earth in common. So we all have ownership of the earth together. And therefore, natural law is man's reason, and this teaches him to not harm another in his life, liberty, or property. So we can all discern that God has done this, Therefore, we need to respect each other because we all have this earth in common. So let's work together to be able to ensure that each has rights to his little aspect of the planet we know and love. So for him, for Locke, government was created to secure man's private property, to permit his acquisitiveness. So he dresses up Hobbes. He takes issue with several of his major points and fixes others, I would say, in order to make it less about just survival of your person and adds property to this. So you're not just defined by your physical body, you also have things, and you care about these just as you care about your own body. And therefore, it's not as simple as what Hobbes would say. You're concerned about the survivability of everything that you own. And therefore, man going into government does not want to give up those things. Whereas Hobbes would err on the side of government, you would have Locke saying, well, hold on a second. The whole reason of us going into society, if he was in the NSA debate, for example, would be to protect his property. And this is his cell phone, right? So government needs to take a second look at what they're doing because this is part of the reason that we join society too. So those are your moderns. Hopefully you're familiar with those guys. Feel free to ask any clarification questions, as I said before. Flipping that sheet over, you get to what we're actually going to talk about in this presentation, which is the Declaration of Independence, first in context of those modern philosophers. So I've got the entire text there. Feel free to skim it. Most of us know it. It's one of the most well-known phrases in the English language, those first few sentences. And it states simply that humans are born free and equal with unsecured rights. Hopefully that sounds familiar. The separate and equal stations to which the laws of nature, that nature's God entitles them, is how Jefferson begins one of his early sentences. He also says that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So rights being insecure, he doesn't say what, but we would assume from other men, other people. Within state of nature, government is instituted to protect them. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So again, we have a nod to the modern philosophers we talked about. Quote, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that's another one. And then the right of people to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So from Thomas Jefferson's point of view, bad government may be discarded when it is exceptionally destructive towards its ends. And you see Jefferson pulling stuff from each one of these major modern philosophers. Most of all Locke, of course, because he's pulling even very similar phrases when he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not going so far as property, because that was changed. But he's nodding to modern philosophy and saying that government, it can be thrown off, and we can resort back to a state of nature whenever it's destructive towards ends. Therefore, government exists to serve us, to help us re-achieve those original rights that we had in state of nature, but in a more safe and sustainable fashion. So, distinctly modern language from Thomas Jefferson here. Acceptance of a modern definition of natural law. So he says self-evident, and that's a big key word there to say that this is everything that I'm saying here is discernible by reason. That anybody who's actually sane and who's actually looking at the facts would agree with me, at least in the country for which he speaks, and to say that these things are obvious. A Rousseauian nod towards a more moral but unsecure pre-government life, talking about the equality that we are created with, and then a positive function for government, and that government exists to allow man to achieve his rights, as I've said before. So that's the Declaration, right? Now, is it fully true? Is it entirely true? Is every piece of it true? And here, I would wrestle it to its core and start with a theological consideration. So, the Declaration of Independence invokes nature's God and the Creator in a highly Protestant society. This isn't to necessarily say that it's talking about the Christian God. And if you know anything about Thomas Jefferson's personal theological beliefs, they were definitely divergent from what a lot of Protestants would hold true. However, as most of you know, many Jews and Christians tend to advocate their faith right alongside the Declaration of Independence. That's been the case from the very beginning. William Lloyd Garrison, a famous 19th century abolitionist, used to say the two rocks are the Bible, Old and New Testament, and then the Declaration of Independence, and I advocate them both fully. And you can hopefully agree that most conservatives tend to think the same thing today, that many of them who are Christians or Jews tend to say that, yes, my faith is totally in line with what I read in the Declaration of Independence, or at least it overlaps enough to where those two things don't have major contradictions. But what I've provided for you here is just some actual quotes from Scripture, first from Genesis, and you feel free to read the whole couple of chapters in Genesis. And I'm not really bringing Genesis up, for any any sort of scientific debate or anything like that. It's more for the philosophical context here, because in Genesis you find actual state of nature theory. You have a time before there's an actual civilization or government as we would know it. And when you look through Genesis, and again, I'm no theologian here, but looking through it, just a general reading or an amateur reading, you don't see God endowing people with those same rights that Thomas Jefferson is mentioning. You see God actually providing man rule over the earth and its creatures. You do see some notion of equality in that God recognizes the value of all humans. He does this more explicitly after Noah, later on in Genesis, when he restricts murder. He says the value of human life prevents people from actually murdering them without sinning or going against the actual covenant that God's created. But more than this, you see responsibilities and obligations. You see God giving Adam and his wife Eve things to do, things that they have to do in order to please God, tasks, naming animals or subduing the earth or cultivating it, finding their food and plants. God is giving them a long list of obligations that they actually owe him. You also see God not really taking their liberty nor their pursuit of happiness very seriously, or at least not respecting it to the point that he allows them to differ with what he has instituted as his law or doctrine. And so what I mean by this is that there are sometimes through Genesis when God actually rewards Adam or satisfies his desires. When, for example, Adam wants a helper, he wants a wife, or wants someone to ease his loneliness, God provides Eve and says, from your body I've created a helper for you to have, and therefore Adam is satisfied, and he goes on with his life. But then there are times when God actually punishes Adam and Eve for their desires or for trying to seek their own happiness in terms of the knowledge of good and evil. When Eve eats of the tree in the book of Genesis, God isn't too happy. And despite their desires, despite them wanting to know or have that power, God punishes them according to his own morality in spite of whatever rights that Thomas Jefferson would have mentioned. And so, additionally, in Genesis, the question of why is government instituted tends to be fairly mysterious. It's not clearly articulated or dictated by God. You see, if you read the Old Testament, you'll see the government just kind of sprouts up for the most part. I've added another excerpt here from Exodus, where you see Moses sitting in place of divine judgment over the actual Hebrews. And you see this is actually a Gentile, so someone out of the Hebrew culture. This is his father-in-law who's injecting democracy, or at least aristocracy, into what he's done as a means of pure pragmatism. Saying to Moses, hey, how are you going to be able to judge all these people as a king? There's a lot of them, only one of you. You're going to wear yourself out, bro. So he's saying, how about you delegate some of this, and then it'll make it easier, and people will go satisfied, and God will actually be pleased by what you're doing, and Moses proceeds to do just that. I don't have it in here, but in the book of Samuel, you have God expressing dissatisfaction with Israel's choice of a king. So the Israelis or the Hebrews at the time wanted to be able to have a king to rule over them, and God expressed dissatisfaction. So it's a little complicated, and even outside of Israel, it's complicated with the Tower of Babel, and God actually confusing all the people who are building up their society, building up a building to be able to reach the heavens. So you don't have an answer from what I see in the Bible. And certainly nothing as clear as what Jefferson provides. And then when can government be overthrown? You do see this, actually, but it's always in line with God's will. For example, Moses' rebellion from Exodus that is actually directed by God. So there are times when government can be overthrown, revolution occurs. And that's what the entire book, of course, of Exodus is about. But it's a little murky here in terms of when that can actually happen, what the criteria are. So, I would say that Judaeo-Christian scripture has some overlap with the Declaration of Independence. And so the conservatives who defend both are not wrong, especially in terms of the emphasis on equality. But otherwise, it also casts serious doubt, especially on rights talk, when we get into what rights we actually have. as well as a positivist form of government. So what can government do? So you have Jefferson saying government is here to help us re-achieve those rights that we originally had in the state of nature, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then when you actually look through the scripture, you don't see that form of government being articulated because the Old Testament is so agnostic on the question of government's origins and purposes. So that's what I get out of the actual Old Testament from what I can actually see and read. I would add one more argument here, and there are several of us who look to Burke for a lot of answers on political questions. So I've added him here because it speaks to me and kind of gives me a bridge in terms of the Declaration of Independence and Judaeo-Christian scriptures. And so Burke articulates what I would call the traditionalist or the historical argument, speaking not only for himself but Koch and others who also bought into what he was saying. And Burke's philosophy, and you can see I've got a couple different quotes here that I've put together, challenges several things in the Declaration of Independence. Number one, the actual, as well as modern philosophy. Number one, the validity of state of nature theory. So Rousseau and others said, yes, I'm thinking about state of nature. I know that it's not actually probably true or historically accurate, but as a theory, it's valuable for what I do. It tells me what government doesn't do. It tells me what society is like before government, and then therefore I know what I can expect from it and what I can actually judge. I can see outside of government. Burke would say, number one, you're right in that it's historically inaccurate because we weren't there, we don't know, and he doesn't particularly take Judeo-Christian scriptures as a historical account of what happened. So we weren't there, we can't guess. Our origins are shrouded in mystery, as he would say it. But he would also say it's not even important to consider this as a theory, because what is more important in the state of nature is to know that our earliest records and everything that we have indicate that man has always existed in society. And of course has continued to do so. This means that society, number one, is good for man, which we can probably all agree, but number two, that it's natural. So Burke would say our state of nature, our actual natural existence, is with government, is with civil society, is with people, right? So you're talking about a state of nature, but you're actually living in it. To actually conceive of something outside of state of nature, that's something totally different than what you're trying to do. So civil society, government being natural for man, and man outside of civilization being natural, Burke is challenging the very notion from whence modern philosophy, as well as the Declaration of Independence, is getting its morality. So an example of this, you can think of Tom Hanks, right, on his character in Castaway on the island is miserable. At one point in the movie, he's trying to either kill himself or die trying to get away from that island, right? And so Burke would say that's an indication of what I've been talking about, in that he's losing his humanity out there, right? He's not the noble savage of Rousseau. He's not a person who's scared for his life, as Hobbes would say, and he's not someone who's concerned about property rights. He's a man who is in need of social relationships, and without those, he's losing everything that makes him a man. And so it's silly to consider that and to try to draw lessons from that experience, because it's more of an indication of a horrible thing. He would call it a shivering nature. Man's weakness is portrayed there. And so instead of looking to that period of life or theory or whatever you would call it, we should look more to where we're at now to draw lessons. So let's work on state of nature. He also challenges the notion of metaphysical or abstract rights. So this is something we almost all take for granted in this country, that rights exist. We have them, right? They're self-evident, as Thomas Jefferson would say. But Burke would say, what is a right? Can you actually show me what your right looks like? You know, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. Burke would say, and you can see the quote here that I provided, that let's take the idea that those rights exist. They're so refracted and complicated in our society because human beings are complicated, that to speak of them in the abstract sense is counterproductive. It's almost useless. Society exists to further man's development and allow him to maximize his nature, sure, but being complex, our notion of rights, our notion of powers, of what's afforded to us by government is just as complex. And anybody who's taken constitutional law classes have probably seen this, right? As we encounter new situations, it gets more complex. So the NSA situation fits. None of us would say or really talk about a right to err, but if in society, because we take it for granted. But what if we're living on a lunar colony, right? All of a sudden, the right to err becomes very important. And as society gets more complex, rights change, rules change, powers change. And this is what Burke is saying, is that, fine, if you want to believe that powers are afforded to people, I buy on that. That's what man does have rights. But let's keep that in mind when we're actually talking about and how realistic it is in the society that we live in. So, and then finally, that's Burke on rights. Finally, why is government instituted? Burke would say that it's out of an inheritance. So, we're here now, right? And past generations have got us to this point, so they must have done something right. We know from our records that they've all had government, so government must be some form of good. It's also, government provides a sense of order and stability. So, humans function on the assumption of some truth, and you can see that in the quote that I provided when he talks about society being a contract about halfway down, a partnership of the living and the dead and future generations. So, what he's talking about there is an actual organization of society that transcends the self-evident truths that Thomas Jefferson is talking about. So when Thomas Jefferson is talking about self-evident, it's a nod towards the natural law theory that I mentioned before from Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, saying all men can see this. Whereas Burke is talking about a truth that transcends just the work in government for years. Burke speaks to us from a point of view saying that absolute rights is very hard to measure in a society as complex as ours. And so, should they be defended? Yes. Should we try to provide people as much freedom as possible? Sure, to the extent that it's practical and feasible. But the actual way it works out in constitutional law is extremely complicated. So it's wisdom that speaks to that. It's experience that speaks to that. It's an actual understanding of how the government operates, of how people operate, and what is required to enforce those rights, to protect those rights for people. So, and that's what I see so much in conservatism that worries me sometimes, is that we're defending these rights as if they are perfect or absolute, and that everybody should have rights to any weapon they want. That's crazy, and think about that for a second, Lord. That, everybody should have complete privacy or freedom. If the Onion came out with a story where, I think it was Ariel Castro, the guy who kidnapped this daughter, and it was an op-ed from him arguing in favor for privacy, right, and freedom. So an actual understanding of where that paradigm is, where we're actually at in defending our rights, if you would take them to be something valid worth defending, which of course I do. A qualification of that and understanding how it actually plays out in government is what provides Burke's point of view versus someone, Thomas Jefferson, who is speaking, as I said before, to justify inaction. People need hope and inspiration at a time whenever they're about to fight the greatest empire at the time. And to be able to speak from that point of, I'm not really concerned about practically how this is going to work out. I'm concerned about speaking from a point of confidence. Right? That's where those two things come from. So I don't think that they're sitting there like butting heads. Right? I think that they're both speaking from different points of view. It's why they were able to work together so successfully. Yes, sir.
I guess I'm a little concerned about your characterization of the biblical idea of liberty as not really being one of concern to the Old Testament God, especially in the creation story, right? Because liberty is something he gives Adam and Eve to a great extent. There's just a clearly defined boundary to it. You mentioned that the naming of the animals is even an essence of a duty he imposed upon them. But that's a freedom that they enjoy, is to name, right? It's a privilege of theirs, and he doesn't care what they name them. We could have named a horse and cow, but
sure,
he would be fine with that. So my question is then, this idea of ordered liberty, liberty within boundaries, and what are those boundaries? It's something you're alluding to even in the Snowden example and all these other things. It's behind a lot of what you're saying, that our rights and our duties eventually rub up against each other, but without answering the specifically theological question of where those duties actually come from, how far can we get into answering this question, right? Must we have recourse to something like the Ten Commandments, or theologically specific program in order to define those freedoms for us?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Fantastic question. And I love how you brought up the notion of rights with responsibilities and the distinction you made there, and then they have an end. So yes, you have your liberty. Go about and name them whatever you want. Name them, right? So it's a mixture of both. That's what I love, and I think when you get into to the modern philosophy and that Jefferson used, and then you think about, like as Nick was talking, how do we interpret this and make this useful for today? So much of our country changing from a period of time where we were tiny, like group of colonies trying to be able to fight off empire, to a time where we are that empire, right? We are now a great empire. Responsibility comes into the picture, so now how do we use this truth to be able to do what we need to do? So the very notion of rights with responsibilities is fantastic, something we need to consider. When I talk about scripture, so again, I'm not a theologian, so don't take my word as anything more than an opinion. But I would encourage you to read Locke's first treatise on government, if you haven't. That's really where I'm getting at here. Is in college, I was always taught, read the second one. And I was like, what about the first? And don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter. It does matter. And when I read it, I was like, ooh, this makes a lot more sense, because this entire first treatise of government, Locke's, is very different than what I actually got out of Scripture. Because he picks and chooses a couple of verses and ignores certain ones, like you mentioned, the Ten Commandments. He kind of omits every part where God is giving liberties with responsibilities, or he's giving men duties, or anything else. It's really just an open-ended deistic. It's like, okay, so God gave us the earth, and then he left. What happens next? I don't know, but let's talk properly. And then his entire second treatise is on that. And so all I'm simply saying is that the discussion that you're saying, that the things that we need to sort out, the notion of rights given to us for an end, is something that Americans have to begin to jump into. Conservatives should jump into, liberals should as well. And that is what you're seeing practically. That, I would argue, is very self-evident, and that if we use some kind of great welfare program to help people, and we say that you have powers to this, or a right to this in this country, as FDR would say, where's the responsibility with that? So, we give you a subprime loan to be able to get a house, but then what happens if you don't pay it? What happens if you don't take care of the house? Right? That is a problem we run into in this country, and people tend to interpret Thomas Jefferson as giving a very liberal view of rights. It's very open-ended if you don't take the time to actually think about it and reflect on it. And so, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I can do whatever I want, and yet everything that follows Thomas Jefferson is limiting that, or it's qualifying that, or it's saying, yes, pursue your happiness, but not at the expense of others. Yes, pursue your happiness, but not to the extent that you're self-destructive. So we do a lot of qualification and adding responsibilities. And if people can begin to take those responsibilities and see how that meshes and works with rights, then we're going to be much better off in terms of how we make this document function for us in the future. So, very good question. Probably do one more, maybe two. Yes, sir.
I thought what was kind of fascinating was just you talking about, I guess, kind of an imagination of what Burke had said if he was writing the Declaration of Independence, and kind of talking about how George King III is the more revolutionary, whereas the American people are the ones kind of keeping consistent with, I guess, what is right. But I'm curious because it's clear that the Founding Fathers were breaking new ground. They were actually creating a new nation. They were doing something that they knew probably hadn't been done before, as far as they were concerned. So, in regards to making something new, and having almost a new history that's being created, they can't really look back to their American history as of yet to pull up those truths that Burke would would value, unless they want to pull those truths as Englishmen. But they're American now. They know they're going to become American. So maybe Thomas Jefferson is actually falling back onto these rights and trying to tangibilize these rights more so than talk about the history, because history would link them back to England. So in regards of the Founding Fathers making a new nation, does that kind of explain maybe more of why Jefferson worded the Declaration of Independence the way he did?
So I've had an entire presentation on this before, in that qualifying what you just said about Americans created a new nation. Practically, yes. Theologically and philosophically, no. And that's what I've tried to show here. So that's why I had all three of the modern philosophers, and you saw, especially with Locke, but also the other two, how much of what Jefferson is using draws from them, right? So in that, insofar as he does that, not new. My last presentation actually that I gave in DC was talking about how amidst the Continental Congress you have complete chaos, 2/3 of the way through. People openly admitting that we are failing. This is not working out. Alexander Hamilton is at the throne of one of the other delegates, and George Washington is just like, forget it. This is not working. And that's when Benjamin Franklin stands up and says, God governs the affairs of men. And his entire text of what he's saying is that we set out to start a new nation. We set out to learn from history, and then apply those to build something better. And mixed government was going to be the solution. It's not working. Compromise is not happening. And that's when they go into a prayer session and we all fall back on the common faith to be able to build something. And Franklin says, without objection, that it was our faith that got us through the Revolutionary War, and it was our faith that's going to get us through this or nothing. Right? So what he's doing there, and I'm not arguing that, this country, is a Christian country or Judaeo-Christian heritage is the most important aspect. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that what they're doing is they're submitting to something greater than themselves and the newness of what they're doing. So are they building something new? Yes, practically. It's American. It wasn't there before. But insofar as they subject themselves to history from the past, use philosophy from others, and then have some common identity in their faith that preceded the United States, it's not. It's a mixed bag of the old, with some minor tweaks and some changes, and then apply to do something that had not been done before. So you take all of that together, and sure, you've got progress. But I would definitely hesitate to fixate on the newness of it as if that was its impetus or its philosophical drive. Does that make sense?
It does.
We'll do one more and then I'm done. If you must got one. Oh, that's it? Cool. All right. I think we'll get next, Rick.
Right. So now we're going to go into a just short 5-minute break or so, and then we're going to have a panel on taxation.
Cool.
So thank you very much, Wes.
Yeah, thank you.